once again, thank you all for joining us. Very happy that you are here. Thank you all on ACIM Gather, and thank you all who are watching this on YouTube. Always great that you're doing that, and I always love to get your little comments that you put, which you are able to put when you watch on YouTube. So thank you all. Okay, this is the last week in January, and I feel that I am through the holidays now. I got through the holiday excitement and chaos that exists. And one of the things that people like to do, and actually that I like to do, is to set resolutions and goals at the beginning of the year. And what I have learned is that it works a little better for me to wait for me to get through the holiday madness or the holiday energy so that I'm a little more centered and maybe peaceful, and really then tune in to the Holy Spirit and set the goals and resolutions with the Holy Spirit's guidance. I don't want to set them from my chaotic ego mind. And of course, the miracle says the first thing to consider very simply is, what do I want to come of this? What is it for? The clarification of the goal belongs at the beginning. So what do I want to come of this year? What is this year for? So also going on for the CMC and Reverend Kelly and myself at the beginning of the year and the end of last year was moving. So we moved from our office that we had been in for 30 years. We moved out of the space that we had been having meetings in for 30 years. And that, of course, added to the hecticness and the chaos, or just the activity. And when I did that, because we were moving into a much smaller office space, had to go through everything in our big office space, all the files, and get rid of things, which included a tremendous amount of paper files that I had been accumulating for 30 years. So you can imagine the amount of paperwork that an organization that is active, is doing events, accumulates. I brought several loads of just my car packed full of papers to the recycling place down in the 100 Point area of the city, plus we packed our recycling can full for weeks and weeks and weeks. It was a tremendous amount of paper that we threw away, and I went through everything just to make sure I wasn't throwing away anything important, but also just to complete the experience of it all. And that was, I've talked about it, was very wonderful for me. It was very enlivening for me, because I got to complete certain things and say, okay, I'm done with that. So when I think about what this year is going to be about, what I keep getting is to truly challenge myself with some of the teachings of A Course in Miracles, and especially the teaching that says there is no death, the Son of God is free, and teachings that really talk about how we're not our bodies, and that the only reasons why our body goes through this aging process that seems to end frequently in death is because of thoughts that we're having, and implying that a different experience could actually be had. And I don't know if that means physical immortality, but I certainly want to not limit my bodily experience to a life that has this certain course where it gets older and it begins to lose vitality, and then eventually it passes. I want to really open myself up to other experiences. So if you've been listening to some of the talks, I talked about this. I challenged the idea of death, that we have to go through this experience, certainly the way that it seems to be. And some people have been communicating with me, and they challenged me on this. And they said, one person in particular, said that if you look at all the perennial wisdoms, all the world's great philosophies and religions, you don't find anything in them that talks about physical immortality. First of all, I didn't really think I was talking about physical immortality, but I was implying that I'm at least open to the possibility, and I don't know what's there, and I don't want to limit the bodily experience. So this person said, if you look at the perennial wisdoms, none of them have that. And A Course in Miracles is one of the profound perennial wisdoms, and he thought I was misinterpreting it by thinking it was leading to that. So that got me thinking about perennial wisdoms or perennial philosophies that I have studied. And does A Course in Miracles fit into them? So that is the idea that I'm going to challenge us with. I'm going to put that idea on the shelf just for a minute. while I talk about some perennial philosophies that have been very significant for me. So the one thing that I've truly embraced, probably my first real spiritual program that I embraced, was my study of the Tao Te Ching. And I studied the Tao Te Ching for many years when I was in my late 20s. Now, the Tao Te Ching it's spelled T-A-O-T-E-C-H-I-N-G, and some people, see it and pronounce it like a T, like Tao Te Ching, and some people pronounce that T like a D, like Tao Te Ching. But the truth is, it's Chinese doesn't differentiate between T and D, so you really have to try to aim for in between them. That's it. So it's the Tao Te Ching. So you can think about that and practice that, and if you can get that right, you'll sound like a Chinese person, because you'll be using the DT sound. So the Tao Te Ching was written, apparently, it's certainly a myth about how it was written, probably 600 years before the birth of who we think of as Jesus, or before the Common Era now, by a man named Lao Tzu. I'm going to give you just a little bit of history. So the myth is, there's no way any of this can be proved, but the myth of Taoism and Lao Tzu and the Tao Te Ching is that Lao Tzu was the librarian for the royal court for the king. And as the librarian, of course, Lao Tzu was literate. Lao Tzu could read, and a lot of the people in that era, 600 years before the Common Era, could not read. So Lao Tzu had all access to all the great wisdom that was there to be had, and is said to be a very wise man himself. And so people came to Lao Tzu for counsel, and the king came to Lao Tzu for counsel on how to rule the land. And apparently Lao Tzu gave the king a lot of really wise counsel over the years. So the king and others kept asking Lao Tzu, as he became older, to write down his wisdom, so that when he made his transition, the wisdom of Lao Tzu would be preserved. And Lao Tzu always denied this, that he would not do it, that it couldn't be written down. But at a certain point, when Lao Tzu was older and got the guidance to go off and make his transition wherever, to live the last part of his life in a different way, Lao Tzu finally acquiesced and wrote down the wisdom that Lao Tzu had. And what Lao Tzu wrote down were 81 short little, almost poems, but just little essays, very short. And that's what the Tao Te Ching is. It's this collection of these 81 little poems. And the thing, of course, to remember is that Lao Tzu was also writing these kind of specifically for the king. So in them, there's a lot of teaching about how to be a wise ruler. And there is other teachings in there, but it's definitely geared towards how to be a wise ruler. And one of the great quotations from the Tao Te Ching, which a lot of people know, is that governing a nation is like cooking a small fish. Too much handling will spoil it. So a lot of the teaching of Taoism is about giving things a light touch. Don't overdo it. Step back a bit. Give it a light touch. The Tao itself, the word, means the way. But it's also, it means more than that. It's the way of the totality. And it's the way of the divine, though they probably wouldn't use that word. Actually, the word Tao becomes synonymous with the divine. But also implied in Tao is this flow, this current, kind of like will. So this flow. So there's always, you have to remember that aspect of Tao when you think about it. It's the flow, the way a stream flows or a river flows. Te itself means virtue, and Ching means great book. So it's the flow, the way of virtue. This is the great book that teaches that. So the Tao Te Ching. So the way, the flow. And in our own vernacular, the idea of go with the flow is actually a very Taoist idea. You go with the flow. You don't fight the current. So getting back to this idea about perennial philosophies and perennial wisdom. So what exactly does that mean? And that refers to this idea of perennialism, which I looked up. Perennialism is a perspective within the philosophy of religion which views each of the world's religious traditions as sharing a single universal truth on which the foundation of all religious knowledge and doctrine has grown. And it was made popular by a book written by Aldous Huxley in 1945 called The Perennial Philosophy, where he popularized this idea that had been around, but he popularized it, that all the world's religions, when you go to their core, have all been inspired by the same revelation. And we have accepted this, and it's very spiritually correct to say this. If you say this, everybody will nod nicely, that all the world's religions come from that same inspiration. And the trouble with that is, I don't really think it's true. And it also leads to some things that are probably pretty questionable, some practices. Or maybe it's true on an absolute sense, but that absolute sense is so hard to connect to that it becomes not a very practical thing and not a very practical idea. So, well, it's something to think about. Now, I did want to read to you just one of the little poems in the Tao Te Ching. This is chapter 25. And it says, "There is a thing, a gathering, which existed prior to heaven and earth, silent, empty, existing by itself, unchanging, pervading everywhere, inexhaustible. It might be called the mother of the world. Its name is unknown. I simply call it Tao. If I were to exert myself to define it, I might call it great. Great means extending to the limitless. Extending to the limitless means reaching the extreme distance. Reaching the extreme distance means returning to nearness. Thus, Tao is great. Heaven is great. Earth is great. The king is great too." So that's a pretty kind of typical little chapter in the Tao Te Ching, as you can see. And for many, many years, some time ago, 35 years ago, I would probably have called myself a Taoist. That was the spiritual discipline that I embraced, actually before I moved to San Francisco. When I moved to San Francisco, the only book I brought with me was this particular edition of the Tao Te Ching, which I had in my backpack on the plane. Still have this particular book, only book I brought with me. I moved here very light because I was a Taoist. I was living lightly on the land, 2 suitcases and a backpack. I was a minimalist, which the Taoists sometimes are, and I lived simply, or at least I tried to live simply, and it served me very, very well for many, many years. I probably would have never been able to move to San Francisco with just 2 suitcases and a backpack had I not been a Taoist, because I was practicing that idea of being a minimalist. I was, going with that flow of thought. I came here with very little money. I came here probably with a couple $100 in my wallet. I knew no one. I only had a place to stay for a couple of nights with some friends of friends who I didn't really know. I had $2,000 in a bank account, which I was going to have wired to me after I got here and after I'd set up a bank account, which means I didn't have access to that $2,000 for like 2.5 weeks after I moved here. I just lived off a couple $100. So it was a ballsy thing to do. Being a Taoist served me at that time, but I don't consider myself a Taoist anymore. I am not going with the flow. I just don't really consider that I go with the flow. Actually, I think I go against the flow. I'm not going with the way the water flows. I think I'm doing something else. So, how does the way the water flows, you kind of have to look at, how do we tend to live our lives? So let's do something secular. How do we live our lives in terms of relationships and in terms of love, when we feel like we want more love in our life? Well, everybody would say that love means you have to be vulnerable. In other words, you have to open yourself up to being hurt, possibly. You have to open yourself up to pain, and people have difficulty doing that, so they shut down, so they're not vulnerable, and they don't have love in their life. And this is the common thought of the world. A Course in Miracles is a very different thought. A Course in Miracles is teaching us to love without ambivalence, love without that idea. There's an attendant amount of vulnerability that's needed, that there is an attendant amount of pain or fear that might be circulating around love. I mean, generally, we open ourselves up to be vulnerable, And then we find somebody or someone or things that don't appear to cause us pain, and they don't, usually at the beginning, and then we embrace those things. These must be the chosen ones, because I'm not feeling the pain and I was vulnerable. But inevitably, because we were preparing for that pain, pain tends to come in at some point. So, A Course in Miracles tells us no one considers it bizarre to love and hate together, and even those who believe that hate is sin merely feel guilty and do not correct it. This is the natural condition of the separation, and those who learn that it is not natural at all seem to be the unnatural ones. If you love like A Course in Miracles tells you to love, you are going to seem unnatural. That's because you're going against the flow of the way society and the world generally sees things. It isn't just about who you love and how many you love. It's about the attitude that we hold of love itself, that it's just this joyful, wonderful, happy, simple, natural thing that you don't have to be vulnerable for, that you just have to be open to it, indulge in, and jump in the water and splash around in. It's like that. You know, there's an old song that I love, and it'll become more prevalent later on. That's by Foreigner. It's called "I Want to Know What Love Is." And then Brian Carey popularized it a few years ago. But I think it talks about that idea. It says, in my life, there's been heartache and pain. I don't know if I can face it again. But I can't stop now. I've traveled so far to change this lonely life. I want to know what love is. I want you to show me. Yeah, I want a different kind of experience of love that doesn't have this attendant fear and anger and pain, that I'm always defending myself. I know I have to be vulnerable, but then I know I'm going to be hurt, and then I'm probably going to shut down at some point as I get older, because, you know, it's just all those attendant ideas. That's the flow. We got to go against that flow. You know, we got to go against that flow. That flow is not healthy. My life is not like cooking a small fish. It just really isn't. If I clung to Taoism because it served me well 27 years ago, it would be like clinging to all those papers at the 2269 Market Street office that I went through and threw out. You know, I think it's been really good for me to review Taoism a little bit, and there's certainly a lot of wonderful things in that teaching, but I don't really believe that all the perennial philosophies are all actually the same, or that that's a practical idea to hold. In many ways, they're very, very different. And we have to embrace what A Course in Miracles teaches, not what all the other philosophies teach. So it might be good to know what they teach and to see what is useful, but you got to embrace one. And that's part of the problem with putting too much emphasis on the perennial wisdom, perennial philosophy idea, is because it makes them all the same. So why bother to really devote yourself to one? Because they're all teaching you the same thing, right? And I think it fosters a kind of lazy spirituality. I mean, I don't really have to do the work because they're all going to the same place and it doesn't really matter. But it does matter. And they aren't all going to the same place. A Course in Miracles has a lot of teaching about doing stuff, not going with the flow, being on the great crusade, being part of the great awakening. It's about disrupting the flow. Course in Miracles says, you are not making use of the Course if you insist on using means which have served others well, neglecting what was made for you. If A Course in Miracles is your path and was made for you, then you have to engage in it. You have to use those means. Don't use means that served others well. Allow those means to serve others well. Don't use means that served you well years ago. I'm not going to devote myself to Taoism. It served me well 27, 30 years ago. It wouldn't serve me well now. It served me well when I didn't really know what Holy Spirit wanted for my life. I would set goals with my ego mind. And Taoism served me well in that consciousness. But I don't do that anymore. I set goals with the Holy Spirit guidance. And sometimes you need to think big. And sometimes you need to go against the flow. Perennial philosophy is a kind of reductionism. You reduce everything to its lowest common denominator. And that's the trouble. It's the lowest form of spirituality you can probably get. It's not going to take you very far. And at a certain point, you do something else. You know, I had a talk with people about Course in Miracles, and you know, it's 365 daily lessons designed to do one a day. And they say, well, you know, reduce it down to just one lesson for me. You know, they want the one lesson to do. And there isn't one lesson, there's 365 of them. I mean, I could sum it up or say something, you know, that wonderful, but it isn't there. So go with the flow, live lightly, rule with a gentle hand. I question that. The flow is flowing you right towards disillusion and death. You do not want to go with that flow. The way water flows is right into the sewer. You do not want to go necessarily with that flow. You want to change the flow. You want to be the Tao that is guided by Spirit, that will have the course that you move it into. You want to be the movement. You certainly don't want to be the Tao that is reflected in nature. Nature's trying to kill us. You gotta get that. Nature is trying to kill us. And also, you know, the way water flows, you know, it's not always a gentle stream. Sometimes the water in the stream flows right into the rocks. And sometimes there's a lot of white water in rapids. And sometimes there's huge, violent waterfalls. So the way water flows is maybe not as idyllic as we might think. There is an internal Tao that you want to connect with. You need to connect with that flow. Don't look for it out in the world. Don't look to the world to teach you what that is. You got to go within, connect with that Tao. So it's January, and it's time to think about what we want this year to be about. But go within. Find that Tao that is there within. Don't be the way the water flows. Be the flow. Be the water. Go within. Chart your own course. You are the Tao. That's my talk for today. Thank you very much.